Now, let me start with a secret, or maybe not such a secret. Before I go to sleep every night dutifully, I read your responses to that evening's Cut the Clutter. And night for me begins really late, much later than most normal people's night begins. So I see quite a lot, and I've been seeing over the past couple of days, many of you have been asking, how come I'm not talking about the emergency or the economic emergency in Sri Lanka? So the fact is, I didn't react to it very much because I was seeing nothing in Indian media, and I was seeing very little, hardly anything in international media. Nothing to raise an alarm. Emergency in Sri Lanka? What emergency in Sri Lanka? Now that speaks poorly for my general knowledge. That speaks poorly also for how we in the Indian media, I'm not blaming all the others and not myself, even we did not notice such a big story right next door to us in a very important neighboring country for us. So Sri Lanka is in a full-scale economic meltdown. I will talk about that. But as I began reading up, and as young people who helped me by finding readings and sending them to me, I began sort of delving into those. I got distracted into something which I thought was trivial. Then that turned out to be the real thing. So that is, as I declutter this economic meltdown in Sri Lanka, I also found a good reason to tell you a fascinating story. It's a bit like in Hindi, you say, Hindi walas will know, I don't know how to translate it. I will try my best, but these things lose flavor. आए थे हरि भजन करने, ओटने लगे कपास. That means when you had come to do something really important, like praying to God, you start working on cotton. You start doing something trivial. So as I started reading up, immediately I had that feeling that maybe I was getting distracted into something. But as I read more, I figured that I had found the real thing and the real story. Because we know what has happened in Sri Lanka. What's happened in Sri Lanka is that Sri Lankan foreign exchange reserves are now $2.8 billion. They are about a third of what they were 2 years ago. That's very small, even for a small economy like Sri Lanka. Usually, Sri Lanka is not a poor country. Sri Lanka is the richest country in the subcontinent, richest country of some size in the subcontinent. Sri Lanka's per capita GDP is almost twice as much as India's. Sri Lanka's social indicators are better than Kerala's, or at least the same as Kerala's in most areas, but in some areas even better than Kerala's. And they've been so for such a long time, for a population of just 2.1 crores. So it's not even a large population. And yet, Sri Lanka's rupee has been melting down. Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserves have melted down. Sri Lanka's rupee, it was about 190, 195 over the past couple of days to the dollar. This morning, I saw a story in The Economist. It said it had gone up to 230. So this was a run on the dollar or Sri Lankan rupee. You can decide how you want to put it. But the fact is that there is a big monetary crisis in the country. There is a big price crisis in the country. And there is a big supplies crisis in the country. So Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the emperor of all his surveys, along with 5 other cabinet colleagues who happen to be his family members, right? यहाँ के सब राजकुमार हमारे परिवार के. So he took a decision to impose economic emergency, and this economic emergency was imposed under what is called as Public Security Ordinance. And he immediately announced a retired major general. When you have too much army, one of Sri Lanka's big problems is that they raised a big army in per capita terms, several tens of times larger than, say, India's army. Because for a country of 2 crores to have an army of more than 1 lakh, think about this. India, a country of 138 crores, has an army of 13 lakhs. So think, you can do your calculations. So they have a lot of faltu generals floating around here and there. So he appointed Major General M.D.S.P. Nivon Hela as the controller of civil supplies, right? So this controller of civil supplies then took charge of raiding, of checking out the godowns, of making sure there is no hoarding of what? Sugar, cooking oil, edible oil, kerosene, rice, stuff like that. So country has run short of all of that. And why has that happened? Because most of these things are imported. They are imported by traders who who opened letters of credit on the banks. Now, what's happened is, on the day they opened the letter of credit, the dollar may have been 160 Sri Lankan rupees to the dollar. But since most of these LCs or letters of credit were taken for 180 days, by the time to honor or pay these LCs came, maybe Sri Lankan rupee had gone to 200 already. Now 230, maybe it will settle a bit lower than that. At one point this morning was 230. So these traders are saying, look, I can't afford to pay this because I imported this in dollar. Sri Lankan government has now also issued orders that in future for any other imports, a Sri Lankan importer cannot even take foreign exchange cover, foreign exchange risk cover on their imports. So you know how much of an incentive there is then for somebody to import when you don't trust your own currency. So what's happened in the process is a lot of people have hoarded these commodities. One, traders start hoarding these commodities, and people get into a scarcity mindset and they think that, look, there'll be a very big shortage soon enough. So people also start hoarding in their own homes. Inflation is rising up all the time. In fact, inflation in Sri Lanka used to be high. I remember when we first started traveling in Sri Lanka, say 1985 onwards, you could see that inflation is high. Not that we understood the basics of economics. So initially, when we saw signboards or hoardings in Colombo saying, come to my bank, such and such a bank, offering you 25% on fixed deposits, 1 year fixed deposits, 27%. Our eyes used to pop out कि fantastic, India में तो सिर्फ 8%, 10% मिलता है या 25%, 27%. We didn't quite understand that the higher the interest rate, the weaker the economy and the weaker the currency, and higher the inflation. So Sri Lanka has been raising interest rates now, Sri Lankan Central Bank, to control inflation and to also control money supply now, supply of Sri Lankan rupees. They've also raised what is called as SRR there, which is the same as CRR in India. So that is statutory reserve ratio. That's been doubled from 2% to 4%. That means banks now have even less money available to them. But banks have a demand for money. So banks have now been going back to their central bank and taking more money under their repo option, as it is called. So central bank has been releasing that money to scheduled banks to say, look, you should not be short of cash. So everything is working at cross purposes. It is one unholy big mess. Dollar inflows have stopped. The government also tried that somehow they will tighten monetarily so that interest rates go up in the country. As interest rates go up, maybe dollars will begin to flow back in, because dollar investors will think I will make more money. But if you don't trust the currency, even that doesn't happen. That's not been happening. Now, all this has happened. Government has now placed import bans. Sri Lanka was the first economy in this subcontinent to open. That's why Sri Lanka did so much better than all other countries in the subcontinent, especially India. Sri Lanka has had an open economy for a long time. Sri Lanka is now closing it under this Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his dictatorship of his family. They are now closing it. So Sri Lanka, which had current account convertibility or more or less, now has imposed rules whereby an exporter, when they get money paid for their exports in foreign exchange, they cannot put it in their bank. They have to take it back to the central bank. That's what used to happen in India before 1991, when any foreign exchange incomes had to be deposited with Reserve Bank of India. Then when you wanted to spend foreign exchange on something, you had to go to RBI for a permit again. So Sri Lanka now under pressure is going back there. So everything that had made Sri Lanka so prosperous, the richest country in the subcontinent, the richest large country in this subcontinent, large means a country with more than 1 crore people, all of that is being reversed under this pressure. And what's happening is that the general, the newly appointed general, whose new designation is Commissioner General of Essential Services, basically essential commodities, he's the one going around raiding go-downs, etc. And if you read Sri Lankan press on the internet, unfortunately, not much of Sri Lankan press is free. A lot of it is very government-friendly. Because most of the larger Sri Lankan press is owned by large business houses which have many other interests. It's very unfortunate. In a democracy next door to India, the local media is quite weak. So they've been basically talking about how this is all a result of hoarding and rumor mongering and how there is no real crisis in Sri Lanka. But the fact is that there are import bans on cars, there are import bans on all kinds of things in Sri Lanka. People have been asked to use fuel sparingly, and one minister has already talked about fuel rationing very soon. Now, why has Sri Lanka come to this? I will tell you the reasons, and then I will also explain to you why I used that expression in the very beginning, Aayate Hari Bhajan karne, otne lage kapas, that I thought I'd come to do something really serious and important and got trapped into some trivia or some sideways pursuit, except that in this case I discovered that that was the real thing. Now, there are three main reasons, as I read up, why Sri Lanka's economy has gone into this mess. I will also tell you at the bottom of this, if you add up the three reasons, what is the biggest reason, but that for later. So first reason is that that pandemic-induced tourism collapse. Tourism is one of the biggest, it is the biggest foreign exchange earner for Sri Lanka. Tourism has collapsed, that tourists are not coming to Sri Lanka, and tourism is their big income. So that is gone. Second is falling rupee that I mentioned to you, falling rupee and rising prices. So as prices rise, inflation rises, rupee falls even further because most essential commodities, particularly food, have to be imported and they become more expensive. Become more expensive. Inflation goes up, currency gets weakened. That's a unholy vicious cycle that goes on. But third point is something which I saw in the passing with insufficient discussion on this, and immediately I got interested and began reading up, and then I thought maybe I was getting distracted and I was a bit late already and I should not get distracted. But then as I delved a little more into it, as you dive a little bit deeper, who seeketh, findeth, right? So I found a fascinating story. Now, Sri Lanka is short of food. Sri Lanka is short of agricultural commodities. Because it is short of agricultural commodities and food, it has to import a lot of this. Because it has to import a lot of this, a lot of dollar is spent. A lot of dollar is spent, so the price of dollar goes up because importers want more dollar, right? So at the same time, because the dollar price goes up, imports that come in, imported foods, they become more expensive. As they become more expensive, rupee depreciates because inflation goes up, so dollar becomes more expensive. That is the unholy vicious cycle I spoke about. But what lies underneath this? What lies underneath this is the third cause. And I'm really astounded to see how little it's been discussed. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the emperor of all his surveys in Sri Lanka, he thought for a moment, he had his Mao moment, me Mao Zedong, right? Maybe he spent too much time with Xi Jinping, bartering away his country's, frankly, his family's hometown, Hambantota, and much else. So he did something which is comparable with the stupidity, the mega stupidity that Mao did early on. When Mao said so many pests have to be destroyed, so mosquitoes, flies, rats, I spoke about this once earlier, and also sparrows, right? And all of the Chinese started killing the sparrows. And one day they killed the sparrows and they found because they had killed the sparrows, there were too many insects in their fields. Why? Because sparrows used to eat those insects. That's how nature works. One balances the other. And then they got into such a panic that they actually imported a large bunch of sparrows from friendly country, brotherly country, then brotherly revolutionary country, the Soviet Union. But itni chidiya pakad ke, from where will you find so many sparrows that you can make up for the loss of sparrows in China? So that blighted China's farming for quite some time. So something on the same scale has happened in Sri Lanka because Gotabaya Rajapaksa, because he has no opposition, there's nobody in his sarkar who can tell him, sir, don't do this. This will not work for you because that person might end up in jail or worse, right? So nobody could tell him that what he was doing was stupid. So he announced like overnight that Sri Lanka was going fully organic. And see the story that I'm sharing with you, screenshot from Sri Lankan media that says that he said, I know that there'll be transitional pains, but in spite of that, I am going fully organic. He also said that in a speech that he made at the UN, that Sri Lanka is showing the way to the world by going fully organic, and this is the way to sustainable food production in the world. Except there's one lot of people he didn't ask, and that is the scientists. So just as while messing up with his economy and monetary policy, one lot of people he didn't ask was economists. Similarly, while messing with his agriculture, with his food security, one lot of people he did not consult was scientists. So he went purely by the advice of ideologues. And he said, I am going fully organic. And what happens, when you are a dictator, then nobody says, acha, aise ho jayega, aise ho jayega. For this possibility, you cover like this, because there's nobody to tell you anything. That's the reason I told you earlier that if you take all these three reasons, and sum total of that is dictatorship. When you have dictator, these things happen. So he immediately banned all chemical fertilizers in Sri Lanka, all chemical fertilizers and all pesticides. So what's the situation now? Crops are failing. The tea industry is looking at a 50% loss to their production. In fact, Harman Gunaratne has been quoted by one of these publications, and I'm sharing some of these links with you, who is a master tea maker in Sri Lanka, and who has been added to a group of 46 experts that Gotabaya set up to drive Sri Lanka into totally organic farming. And he's been quoted as saying, the consequences for the country are unimaginable. He says Sri Lanka's tea production, which is today 3,000 million kg, it accounts for 10% of all of Sri Lanka's exports. He says it will be halved. Now, whether the other half, by which time you will be able to get the right price for it on organic basis, you don't know, because losses are now. So that means $1.25 billion of exports per year are today jeopardized. Similarly, cardamom, elaichi, right? It's the prices even in Sri Lanka have gone this much because people know that production is coming down. Cinnamon, Sri Lanka supplies 85% of the world's cinnamon. That crop, suppose that goes into half just because the dictator wants it all to be organic. Pepper, rice, all that is being demolished and all that is suffering. In fact, you have a situation where vegetable growers are now coming out protesting, holding their produce, which are worms and pests in it. Because if we've completely banned pesticides, and all that we have heard from Sri Lankan government, because nobody, when a dictator makes a mistake, nobody dares to correct it. So everybody is saying, I'll do something about it. So even the ministers, they are saying, don't worry, we will soon provide compost organic fertilizer for all, organic fertilizer made of compost for all, organic manure. Now the fact is, I'm so sorry, it's a cheap shot, but if you have nothing to eat, how will you produce compost? So this is really, they have unleashed another vicious cycle, unholy vicious cycle upon themselves. This is purely a man-made or a dictatorship-made crisis. Now, there is a quote I find from W.A. Vijayawardena, who is a former central bank governor, like our RBI governor, who says that this organic business is a dream with unimaginable social, political, and economic costs. Sri Lanka's food security has been compromised. And he says, look, rice is down. Vegetable growers, I told you, are protesting now because their pests are eating up their crops. But Sri Lankan government is not worried because they dare not worry, right? Plantation Minister Ramesh Pathirana says, I told you, I'll give organic compost. Kahan se laega, mujhe pata nahi, for the entire country. But in any case, who's going to ask him? Because to ask him, somebody has to ask his boss. Whoever asks his boss gets into thick trouble immediately. Rajapaksa, on the other hand, speaking to UN, said that his new policy of converting Sri Lanka into a purely organic country will lead to greater food security and nutrition. And this is an example where all the countries in the world should follow Sri Lanka and take the bold steps required to sustainably transform the world food system. Now, the fact is that science doesn't say that. So there is an article in Nature, the respected journal, talking about Sri Lanka, that says, look, even EU, European Union, which is otherwise so politically correct, even they have said that organic farming is much more of an ideology that has the least science and is largely irrational. You have to be rational with the use of chemical fertilizers, with the use of pesticides, but to say that you use nothing of it anywhere is hugely
hugely irrational. I also see an article by Hiranbir Jayasundara in a publication called colombotelegraph.com. Now, I read this article, and this article is headlined Organic Farming in Sri Lanka, Ideology of Hitler and Sri Lankan Agricultural Cults. And I said, wow, Sri Lankan media has really changed. If a publication called colombotelegraph.com is writing articles like this. But I was suspicious because first of all, at least from my traveling days, I did not remember such a publication. And second, knowing Sri Lanka's politics, I thought there can't be a publication like that because even if one is there, it can't survive for long. At least it can't survive for long outside the jail. So I did Google the publication. It is a publication. It's a website that's been set up by the exiled Sri Lankan journalists. Now, in that article, this gentleman, Hiranbir Jayasundara, he talks about all the awful things that have happened because of this completely irrational policy in Sri Lanka. That's the reason I said that I thought I was looking at monetary policy, export meltdown, imports going up, something complicated in sort of the economic and monetary domain, which I may not know much about. So I even checked out with Ramya Nair, who's our business and economy correspondent, and with Ila Patnaik, who's our economics editor. And they did help me understand those monetary issues, etc., so I don't make a fool of myself. But this is a discovery, and this just tells you that, dictatorships are bad. Dictatorships are bad, whether they are military dictatorships, you've seen them in Pakistan next door, or they are religious dictatorships. We've seen them in Afghanistan in the past. We have those in a lot of the Middle East. Or if they are elected dictatorships. We have one next door to us in Sri Lanka. They are bad because dictatorships have no checks and balances. So you have the same kind of situation as you had in China with Mao Zedong. Kill the sparrows, right? Go organic, go organic. Never mind the consequences. If you're starving for some time, we'll starve for a year. So that is what Sri Lanka is going through right now. And that is the underlying cause of the problems of a once bustling economy.